Vex stared across the metal table at the most disappointing war criminal he had ever encountered. The human sat slumped in her restrained chair, picking at her fingernails with all the concern of someone waiting for a delayed transport. Her brown hair hung in greasy strands around a face that belonged in a botanical garden, not a military tribunal. Maya Kane. Age 32. Occupation, plant researcher. Plant researcher. Vex's four eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit that always emerged when reality refused to cooperate with logic. His species, the Corvani, had been expanding across the galaxy for 3 centuries. They had conquered warrior races that could tear through steel with their bare claws. They had subjugated technological civilizations that built weapons capable of cracking moons. And here sat a human who studied flowers, a human who had somehow impossibly, single-handedly destroyed the battleship Dominion's edge. So, Vex began, his translator converting his clicking mandibles into words the human could understand, you expect me to believe that you, what was your exact phrase, accidentally caused a complete system failure aboard one of our most advanced vessels? Maya looked up from her nails, blinking slowly like she had just remembered where she was. Oh, that old thing. Yeah, pretty much. She shrugged, the motion so casual it made Vex's secondary stomachs churn. I mean, I was trying to fix your air recycling system. You guys had some seriously toxic buildup in there, like dangerously toxic. I'm surprised your crew wasn't dropping dead from oxygen poisoning. Oxygen poisoning, Vex repeated flatly. Well, technically it was more complex than that, but yeah. Maya leaned back in her chair, somehow managing to look comfortable despite being secured with enough restraints to hold a Thorian battle beast. Your atmospheric processors were running way too hot, and someone had jury-rigged the safety protocols. Honestly, I probably saved a few lives when I, fixed it. Vex consulted his datapad, scrolling through the incident report for the 15th time today. According to the survivors, Maya Kane had been a model prisoner for 6 days. Helpful, friendly, concerned about the crew's well-being. She had offered botanical expertise to improve their hydroponic food systems. She had suggested modifications to their air recycling that would increase efficiency. And then, somehow, every major system on the ship had failed simultaneously. The atmospheric processors exploded, Vex said, reading from the report. The artificial gravity generators overloaded. Life support went into emergency shutdown. The navigation computers wiped themselves clean. The weapons systems turned on the ship's own hull. He looked up at Maya, who was now examining her reflection in the table's surface. You call this fixing? Well, Maya said, tilting her head thoughtfully, I guess it depends on your perspective. From where I was sitting, everything worked exactly like it was supposed to. There it was again. That casual tone that made Vex want to molt prematurely. This human spoke about the destruction of a battleship the way others might discuss a broken food dispenser. 1,400 crew members, Vex continued, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain professional. 1,400 trained soldiers, engineers, and officers. Gone. Because of you. Maya's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, Vex thought he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Something cold and calculating that didn't match the rest of her harmless exterior. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and her voice carried just enough sincerity to be believable. But maybe you shouldn't have kidnapped a transport full of civilians if you didn't want civilian solutions to military problems. Vex set down his datapad and leaned forward. His species had evolved from apex predators, and despite centuries of civilization, the instincts remained. When faced with a threat, examine it, understand it. Categorize it. But Maya Kane refused to be categorized. You were not listed in any military database, Vex said, trying a different approach. No combat training, no engineering background, no weapons expertise. According to our intelligence, you spent the last 5 years growing vegetables on a research station. Tomatoes, actually, Maya corrected. though I did branch out into some exotic fungi toward the end. You'd be surprised how much chemistry is involved in agriculture. In chemistry. Vex made a note of that. So you maintain that you are simply, what do humans call it, a civilian? An innocent bystander who happened to stumble into destroying our ship. Maya laughed, and the sound sent ice crystals forming along Vex's spine. It wasn't cruel laughter or maniacal, or any of the things he might have expected from a mass murderer. It was genuinely amused, like she found the entire situation mildly entertaining. "Oh, I'm definitely a civilian," she said, still smiling. "I haven't worn a uniform in 6 years. But innocent?" She shrugged again. "I guess that depends on how you define the word." Vex stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. There had to be an explanation. Humans didn't just do things like this. They were a young species, barely capable of interstellar travel. Their military was primitive by galactic standards. Their technology was crude and inefficient. And yet. "Perhaps," Vex said slowly, "you should tell me exactly what happened. From the beginning. Starting with your capture." Maya's smile widened, and Vex realized with growing unease that she had been waiting for exactly this question. "Oh, that's a good story," she said, settling back in her chair like she was about to share a particularly amusing anecdote at dinner party. "See, the thing about being underestimated is that people, well, beings, tend to stop paying attention to you. And when they stop paying attention, they start making mistakes." She paused, her eyes taking on that distant look that suggested she was remembering something pleasant. "And your crew," Maya continued, "made so very many mistakes. The transport ship Peaceful Wanderer." Maya began, her voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a mildly interesting vacation, was about as exciting as its name suggests. 43 passengers, mostly researchers and traders, heading to the Kepler station. I was in seat 12B, reading a fascinating paper on soil microorganism interactions, when your people decided to crash the party. X activated his recording device, though he suspected this testimony would raise more questions than it answered. "The first sign of trouble was when Captain Morrison came over the intercom," Maya continued, absently braiding a strand of her hair. "His voice had that particular crack that screams we are so very dead right now," he said. And I quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties and may need to make an unscheduled stop." "Technical difficulties," Vex repeated. "Well, that was one way to describe having 3 Corvani raiders drop out of hyperspace and lock weapons on your hull," Maya said with a grin. "Though I suppose we are about to be boarded by hostile aliens who probably want to sell us as slaves might have caused more panic than necessary." And Vex's mandibles clicked involuntarily. The Corvani Empire did not officially engage in slave trading, but certain independent contractors operated in the border regions with less oversight than perhaps they should. "The other passengers took it about as well as you would expect," Maya went on. "Mrs. Patterson from the seat behind me started hyperventilating into a paper bag. The Juergens twins were crying loud enough to wake the dead. That pompous businessman, what was his name? Oh, right. Hartwell. He was demanding to speak to someone in charge like customer service was going to fix this situation." Maya paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "You know what I did?" "Enlighten me," Vex said dryly. "I finished reading my paper. It was actually quite good. Did you know that certain fungi can break down complex chemical compounds in ways that mimic industrial processes?" "Fascinating stuff, really." Vex stared at her. "You continued reading while pirates were attacking your ship." "Well, yeah." Maya looked at him like he had asked why water was wet. "I mean, there wasn't really anything I could do about the situation at that point, was there? Might as well learn something useful." The casual way she said it made Vex's skin crawl. Most species, when faced with mortal danger, experienced some form of fight or flight response. Humans, he had read, were particularly prone to panic and emotional outbursts. Maya Kane apparently had the emotional range of a broken thermostat. "When your boarding teams came through the airlock," Maya continued, They were exactly what I expected. Big, scary, lots of weapons, that whole intimidation routine your people do so well. Commander Zalk was leading them, I think. Tall fellow, had that scar across his left eye that made him look like he had seen some serious action. Vex made another note. Maya's recall for details was unusually precise. Zalk started the whole prisoner inspection process, Maya said, gesturing vaguely with her restrained hands. You know the drill. Line everyone up, check identification, decide who might be valuable, and who gets spaced. Very efficient, very professional, and very, very predictable. Predictable? Oh, absolutely. See, when you are dealing with a mixed group of captives, you prioritize based on perceived value and threat level. Maya ticked off points on her fingers like she was reciting a grocery list. The businessmen got flagged immediately because expensive suit equals potential ransom. The scientists got tagged as useful because technical knowledge equals leverage. The families got grouped together because emotional attachments make people compliant. Vex felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. Maya was describing standard Corvani capture protocols with the precision of someone who had written the manual. And then there was me, Maya said, her smile returning, sitting quietly in my wrinkled jumpsuit, holding a data pad full of plant research, looking about as threatening as a wilted daisy. When Zalk got to me, he barely glanced at my identification before marking me as low-priority civilian, which, technically, was completely accurate. But, Vex prompted, because there was definitely a but coming. But he made the same mistake everyone makes when they look at me, Maya said, and for just a moment, her cheerful facade enough to reveal something sharp and dangerous underneath. He assumed that harmless and helpless were the same thing. Vex leaned forward despite himself. What did you do? Nothing dramatic, Maya said, the mask sliding back into place so smoothly that Vex almost wondered if he had imagined that flash of steel. I just paid attention, watched how your people moved, how they communicated, what their priorities were. I counted weapons, noted equipment, memorized faces and rank insignia. She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. Oh, and I started thinking about chemical compounds that could be synthesized from common agricultural supplies. You know, just in case the information became relevant later. Vex's primary hands clenched involuntarily. You were planning sabotage from the moment you were captured. Planning is such a strong word, Maya said with that infuriating shrug. I prefer to think of it as professional curiosity. See, when you spend years optimizing growth mediums and nutrient solutions, you develop a certain appreciation for how delicate biological systems really are. How easy it is for things to go wrong when someone introduces unexpected variables into a controlled environment. She looked directly at Vex, and her eyes held the kind of cold calculation that belonged to a predator evaluating prey. Your ship, Maya continued pleasantly, was just another controlled environment. And I had so many interesting variables to introduce. The holding cells on the Dominion's edge were actually quite impressive, Maya said, settling into her story like she was describing a hotel review. Clean, well-ventilated, temperature-controlled. Much better than the horror stories you hear about alien prison ships. Someone clearly put thought into prisoner welfare. Vex consulted his notes. The Dominion's Edge had been a flagship vessel, equipped with state-of-the-art everything, including, apparently, comfortable accommodations for captives. I was assigned Cell Block 7, Sector C, Maya continued. Shared space with Mrs. Patterson, who was still having periodic panic attacks, and a traitor named Kowalski who kept insisting this was all a big misunderstanding. The food dispenser provided adequate nutrition, the waste recycling was efficient, and the artificial gravity was calibrated perfectly for human physiology. You sound almost grateful, Vex observed. Oh, I was fascinated, Maya said, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. See, maintaining optimal growing conditions for plants requires understanding environmental systems in incredible detail. Temperature fluctuations, humidity levels, air circulation patterns, nutrient cycling, and here I was, getting a first-hand look at how an advanced alien civilization handled life support on a massive scale. Vex felt that familiar chill again. Most prisoners would be focused on escape or survival. Maya had been conducting a technical assessment. The first guard I befriended was Corporal Thane, Maya said. Sweet kid, probably fresh out of training. He was assigned to meal distribution in our sector, and he looked absolutely miserable doing it. So naturally, I started talking to him. Naturally. Well, he was clearly homesick, Maya explained with the patience of someone stating the obvious. Standing there with his shoulders slumped, staring off into space between deliveries. Classic signs of someone missing familiar surroundings. So I asked him about his home planet. Maya's smile took on a fond quality, like she was remembering a pleasant conversation with an old friend. Turns out Thane was from an agricultural world called Verdant Prime, specialized in grain production for the inner colonies. He started telling me about the massive wheat fields, the seasonal flooding cycles, the soil composition that made everything grow so well. Maya paused, shaking her head in amazement. Poor kid had no idea he was giving me a complete breakdown of Corvani agricultural biochemistry. Vex made another note. Agricultural biochemistry could easily translate into knowledge of biological weapons, environmental manipulation, and toxin production. But I was just being friendly, Maya continued innocently, asking questions about growing seasons, fertilizer compounds, pest control methods. You know, shop talk between agricultural professionals. Thane was so excited to find someone who understood his background that he started bringing me technical manuals. Technical manuals? Vex's voice cracked slightly. Oh yes, operational guides for hydroponic systems, atmospheric processing protocols, environmental monitoring procedures. He thought I might find them interesting from a research perspective. Maya's grin widened. He was absolutely right. Vex could feel his career prospects withering like plants in a drought. Security protocols existed for reasons, and sharing technical documentation with prisoners violated approximately 17 different regulations. Of course, I made sure to reciprocate, Maya said. Started sharing some of my own research with Thane. Told him about soil microorganisms that could increase crop yields, bacterial cultures that enhanced nutrient absorption, fungal networks that improved root system efficiency. He was taking notes. Notes, Vex repeated weakly. Detailed notes. See, Thane was planning to go back to farming after his military service, and he wanted to implement some of my suggestions on his family's land. Sweet kid, really. Very motivated to learn. Maya's expression grew thoughtful. Though I probably should have mentioned that some of those microorganisms can turn toxic if they encounter the wrong catalysts. Vex stared at her. You gave him bioweapons research disguised as farming advice. I gave him legitimate agricultural techniques, Maya corrected firmly. The fact that certain biological processes can have multiple applications depending on environmental conditions, well, that's just basic science, isn't it? The casual way she said it made Vex want to throw his datapad across the room. Maya Kane had weaponized small talk. Then there was Sergeant Kovac, Maya continued, apparently oblivious to Vex's mounting horror. She was responsible for atmospheric monitoring in the prisoner sections. Absolutely brilliant engineer, really knew her stuff. We had some fascinating conversations about air recycling efficiency. Let me guess, Vex said. You bonded over environmental systems. Exactly. Kovac was trying to optimize the scrubbers in our section because the CO2 levels were running slightly high. Nothing dangerous, mind you, just inefficient. So I mentioned some techniques I had used for atmospheric management in greenhouse environments. Maya began counting on her fingers again, and Vex braced himself for another list of seemingly innocent suggestions that were probably violations of multiple galactic treaties. Bacterial air filters for organic contamination, chemical scrubbers that could break down complex compounds, pH balancing systems that maintained optimal atmospheric composition. Kovac was so impressed that she started consulting me on other environmental issues throughout the ship. Other issues? Well, The water recycling system had some mineral buildup that was affecting efficiency. The temperature regulation in the engine compartments was causing stress fractures in some of the secondary systems. The hydroponic gardens that supplied fresh food were dealing with a fungal infection that was reducing crop yields. Maya shrugged. Little things that a plant researcher might have insights about. Vex realized with growing dread that Maya had somehow managed to gain access to information about nearly every major system on the ship, all through helpful suggestions and friendly conversations. Of course, I was very careful to stay within my area of expertise, Maya added. I never asked direct questions about weapons systems or navigation or anything obviously military. I just listened and offered advice when it seemed appropriate. Advice. Helpful advice. For instance, when Kovac mentioned that the atmospheric processors were running hot, I suggested some cooling techniques that worked well in agricultural applications. When she complained about corrosion in the filtration systems, I recommended some chemical treatments that were excellent for preventing biological contamination. Maya paused, her expression growing almost wistful. And when she mentioned that the safety protocols kept interfering with efficiency improvements, I explained how you could bypass certain monitoring systems without triggering alarms. You know the way we did it in research facilities when we needed to run experiments outside normal parameters? X set down his datapad very carefully, because if he held it any tighter, he was going to crush it into scrap metal. You taught them how to disable their own safety systems. I taught them how to optimize their operations, Maya corrected. The fact that optimization sometimes requires creative approaches to regulatory compliance, well, that's just practical engineering, isn't it? She looked at Vex with those innocent brown eyes, and he finally understood what he was dealing with. Maya Kane was not just dangerous because she could destroy ships. She was dangerous because she could make people want to help her do it. The environmental crisis started on day 4, Maya said, her tone suggesting she was about to describe a mildly interesting weather pattern. I was in the common area, reading another fascinating paper about symbiotic root fungi, when the air recycling system began making these really concerning noises. Vex pulled up the incident report from that date. Multiple system alarms, emergency maintenance protocols activated, crew scrambled to prevent atmospheric failure. What the report did not mention was any involvement from the human prisoners. At first, it was just a slight irregularity in the filtration cycles, Maya continued, absently examining her fingernails again. A kind of grinding sound that suggested the bacterial filters were struggling with something. Then the CO2 scrubbers started overheating, and the oxygen production units began cycling erratically. And you knew this how? Vex asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would make his molting schedule advance by several months. Well, when you spend years maintaining atmospheric systems in research greenhouses, you develop an ear for mechanical distress, Maya explained cheerfully. Plus, Sergeant Kovac had mentioned the day before that she was implementing some of my suggestions for improving filter efficiency. So naturally, I was paying attention to how the modifications were working out. Vex felt his secondary stomachs clench. You were monitoring the effects of your own sabotage. I was monitoring the effects of legitimate optimization techniques, Maya corrected with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. The fact that certain chemical processes can cascade in unexpected ways when introduced to complex systems, well, that's just the nature of biological engineering. Maya leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more animated as she warmed to her subject. See, the bacterial cultures I had suggested were absolutely perfect for breaking down organic waste products. Incredibly efficient, self-regulating, completely safe under normal operating conditions. But when you combine them with the specific mineral composition of your ship's water recycling system, and then add the particular atmospheric pressure you maintain in the filtration chambers. She made a small explosive gesture with her hands. Well, let's just say that efficiency becomes a relative concept. X consulted his data pad, scrolling through technical specifications he barely understood. The filters began producing toxic compounds. Toxic is such an ugly word, Maya said with a slight frown. I prefer to think of them as unintended byproducts. Though yes, they were definitely not compatible with Corvani respiratory systems, or human respiratory systems, for that matter. Really, they weren't compatible with most carbon-based life forms. You poisoned the air supply. I created a minor atmospheric imbalance that required immediate attention, Maya corrected. And fortunately, I was available to provide expert consultation on the problem. And Vex could practically feel his career evaporating. They brought you into the restricted sections. Maya's smile was radiant. Oh, it was so sweet how worried they were. Poor Kovac was absolutely beside herself, running diagnostics and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The atmospheric readings were showing dangerous levels of, well, several things that really shouldn't have been there. And the backup systems were starting to fail because the contamination was spreading through the ventilation network. She paused, looking thoughtful. Lieutenant Commander Voss was in charge of the emergency response. Competent officer, really knew his stuff. But when you are dealing with a biological contamination event that is affecting life support systems throughout the ship, sometimes you need to consult with specialists. Specialists? Vex repeated flatly. Well, I was the only person on board with extensive experience in atmospheric bioremediation, Maya pointed out reasonably. Kovac recommended me, Thane vouched for my expertise, and Voss was running out of options. So they escorted me to the primary environmental control center. Maya's eyes took on that distant, pleased expression again, like she was remembering a particularly enjoyable vacation. The control center was absolutely beautiful, she said with genuine appreciation. Massive monitoring arrays, real-time atmospheric analysis, automated response systems that could adjust conditions throughout the entire ship. And right there in the middle of it all, the master control interface for every environmental system on the vessel. Vex made a note to have whoever designed the security protocols for that facility transferred to sanitation duty. Of course, I was under constant supervision, Maya continued. 2 armed guards, plus Kovac and her entire engineering team. Very professional, very careful. They watched every move I made. But you still managed to cause more damage. I managed to solve the immediate crisis, Maya said with a hurt expression. The atmospheric contamination was neutralized within 6 hours, the backup systems were stabilized, and air quality returned to normal parameters throughout the ship. Everyone was very grateful. Vex waited for the other shoe to drop. With Maya Kane, there was always another shoe. Though I suppose it was unfortunate that the solution required temporarily disabling some of the environmental monitoring systems, Maya added casually. To prevent interference while the biological agents did their work. Just standard procedure for that type of remediation. You convinced them to turn off their own safety systems. I convinced them to follow established protocols for biological contamination events, Maya corrected. The fact that those protocols happened to create temporary blind spots in the ship's environmental monitoring network, well, that was just a necessary side effect of proper procedure. Maya began counting on her fingers again, and Vex braced himself. We had to disable atmospheric alarms in sections 12 through 18, suspend automated responses in the hydroponics bays, bypass safety interlocks on the water recycling systems, and of course we needed to implement manual override protocols for the atmospheric processors themselves, just in case the automated systems tried to interfere with the cleaning process. She looked up at Vex with those deceptively innocent eyes. The whole ship was essentially running on manual environmental controls by the time we finished. But hey, the air was breathable again, so everyone considered it a complete success. Vex stared at the report, finally understanding what he was reading. Maya had not just gained access to restricted areas, she had systematically convinced the crew to disable the very systems that would have prevented her from carrying out larger sabotage operations. And naturally, Maya continued, since I had proven myself so helpful during the crisis, Voss decided that I should remain available for consultation on ongoing environmental issues. Just in case any other problems came up. They gave you permanent access, Vex said weakly. They gave me a temporary advisory position, Maya corrected. with a security escort, of course. But Lieutenant Torres, who was assigned as my escort, was so interested in learning about biological systems that our daily inspections turned into very educational technical discussions. Maya's smile widened. Torres was particularly fascinated by the relationship between environmental systems and other ship functions, how atmospheric pressure affected structural integrity, how temperature variations influenced electronic systems, how humidity levels could impact everything from navigation computers to weapons arrays. She shrugged that maddening casual shrug. I was happy to share my expertise. After all, when you are trying to maintain optimal growing conditions, you have to understand how every environmental factor affects every other environmental factor. It's all interconnected, really. Change one thing, and everything else starts to shift in response. Vex looked at his datapad, then at Maya, then back at his datapad. Somewhere in the casual recitation of helpful consultations and educational discussions, she had just described gaining access to information about every major system on the ship. And the crew trusted you completely by this point. Oh, they thought I was wonderful, Maya said, with obvious satisfaction. Helpful, knowledgeable, always willing to lend a hand with technical problems. Some of them even started coming to me with personal questions about environmental systems on their home planets. She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. Though I probably should have warned them that the same biological processes that make plants grow really well can also make other things, well, stop working entirely. By day 6, I had become something of a ship celebrity, Maya said, and there was genuine pride in her voice. Word had gotten around about how I had solved the atmospheric crisis, and suddenly everyone wanted to consult the helpful human botanist about their technical problems. Vex scrolled through his files, noting the increasing number of maintenance requests that had been filed during that period. What had seemed like routine ship operations now looked suspiciously like a coordinated intelligence-gathering operation. Chief Petty Officer Nurian was the first to approach me outside of environmental issues, Maya continued. She was having problems with the hydroponic food production systems in the forward galleys, some kind of root rot that was affecting the protein synthesis crops. Very concerning, since food shortages on a long-range vessel can seriously impact crew morale. And naturally, you volunteered to help, Vex said dryly. Well, plant diseases are exactly my area of expertise, Maya pointed out with that infuriating reasonableness. Plus, Nurian was so worried about the situation. Apparently, the Dominion's edge was already 3 weeks behind schedule, and any delays in food production could force them to make an unscheduled stop for resupply. Maya paused, her expression growing thoughtful. Which would have been problematic, since unscheduled stops in this sector tend to attract unwanted attention from patrol vessels. Nurian was very concerned about maintaining operational security. Vex made another note. Operational security, flight schedules, patrol routes, all information that should never have been shared with a prisoner disguised as casual conversation about food production problems. The solution was actually quite elegant, Maya continued. I identified the pathogen as a modified strain of Fusarium oxysporum, which responds very well to targeted antibiotic treatments. But the tricky part was developing a delivery system that would eliminate the infection without contaminating the food supply. I assume you had suggestions. Oh, several, Maya said cheerfully. The most effective approach involved introducing beneficial microorganisms that would outcompete the harmful ones. Sort of like fighting fire with fire, except with bacteria. Nurian was fascinated by the biochemistry involved. Maya began that familiar finger-counting gesture, and Vex steeled himself for another list of seemingly innocent activities that were probably war crimes. We had to analyze the nutrient distribution systems to understand how the infection was spreading, map out the food processing networks to identify contamination vectors, review the storage protocols to prevent reinfection, and of course, we needed to understand the ship's chemical inventory to ensure we had the right compounds for treatment. She looked at Vex with those deceptively innocent eyes. Nurian was so helpful. She gave me complete access to the galley systems, including the emergency food storage areas and the chemical processing facilities. Very thorough documentation. Really excellent security protocols. Though I did notice a few potential vulnerabilities in their containment procedures. Vulnerabilities that you pointed out, I suppose. Well, it would have been irresponsible not to mention them, Maya said with a slight frown. I mean, if someone with malicious intent ever gained access to those systems, they could cause serious problems. Contaminate the water supply, introduce toxins into the food processing networks, even create chemical compounds that could be dispersed through the ventilation systems. Maya shrugged that casual shrug that made Vex want to shed his exoskeleton. So I suggested some improvements to their security procedures. Simple modifications that would make the systems more resistant to tampering. Nurian was very grateful for the advice. Vex realized with growing horror that Maya had essentially conducted a security assessment of the ship's food and chemical storage systems, disguised as helpful suggestions for preventing contamination. Then there was engineering specialist Keldon, Maya continued. A brilliant young officer, really understood propulsion systems. He was dealing with some efficiency issues in the secondary power generators, and someone had mentioned that I might have insights about biological processes that could help with optimization. Biological processes, Vex repeated weakly. Oh yes, see. Power generation in biological systems is actually quite similar to mechanical power generation in many ways. Both involve converting chemical energy into usable work through controlled reactions. The main difference is that biological systems tend to be more efficient because they have evolved to minimize waste products. Maya's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Even Vex realized he was about to receive a lecture on comparative energy systems from someone who had probably used that knowledge to plan the destruction of his ship. Keldon was particularly interested in my work with bioluminescent organisms, Maya said. Certain fungi can generate light through chemical reactions that are incredibly energy efficient, much more so than most artificial lighting systems. We spent hours discussing the biochemistry involved. Hours, Vex noted. Well, Keldon had lots of questions about energy conversion rates, chemical catalysts, reaction optimization, and naturally our conversations expanded to cover related topics. How energy systems integrate with other ship functions, what happens when power distribution gets disrupted, how to troubleshoot cascading failures in complex networks. Maya paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. He even showed me the engineering sections where the main power distribution systems were located. Very impressive setup, really. Though I did notice that the backup systems had some design flaws that could be problematic if someone introduced unexpected variables into the power grid. More helpful suggestions? Just basic safety recommendations, Maya said innocently. For instance, the emergency shutdown procedures could be improved to prevent operator error during crisis situations. And the automated monitoring systems had some blind spots that could be addressed with better sensor placement. Vex consulted his notes, trying to track the expanding scope of Maya's access to critical ship systems. Environmental controls, food production, chemical storage, power generation. She was systematically mapping every vulnerable point on the vessel. Of course, my favorite new friend was Security Officer Renz, Maya continued, and her smile took on a particularly fond quality. Such a dedicated professional, really took his job seriously. He was assigned to escort me during my expanded consulting duties, and we had the most educational conversations. About security protocols, I assume. Well, Renz was very interested in biological warfare countermeasures, Maya explained. Apparently, there had been some incidents in the outer sectors involving botanical toxins, and he wanted to understand how such weapons might be deployed and detected. Maya's expression grew serious, as if she was discussing a matter of genuine professional concern. So I explained the various ways that plant-derived compounds could be weaponized. Airborne spores that could be dispersed through ventilation systems, contact toxins that could be applied to surfaces, water-soluble poisons that could contaminate drinking supplies, Standard defensive information that any security officer should understand. Defensive information. Absolutely. How can you defend against something if you do not understand how it works? Maya looked at Vex like he had asked why gravity made things fall down. Renz was very thorough in his questions. He wanted to know about detection methods, decontamination procedures, emergency response protocols. She paused, her smile widening. And naturally, he needed to understand how the ship's existing security systems might be vulnerable to such attacks, where the monitoring equipment was located, how the alarm systems functioned, what the response procedures were for different types of threats. Vex stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. Maya had not just gained access to critical ship systems. She had convinced the security officer assigned to watch her to provide a complete briefing on the ship's defensive capabilities. Renz was so impressed with my knowledge that he started bringing me to security briefings, Maya added casually. You know, just as a consultant on potential biological threats. Very educational sessions, really. I learned so much about ship layout, crew assignments, patrol schedules. She shrugged that maddening shrug one more time. Though I suppose it was unfortunate that all of that defensive knowledge could also be applied offensively, if someone was inclined to think about such things. Which, of course, I would never do. Maya looked at Vex with those innocent brown eyes, and he realized that she had just described conducting a complete intelligence operation against his people, disguised as helpful consultation on ship security. And everyone trusted you completely. Oh, they adored me, Maya said with obvious satisfaction. Helpful Maya, always willing to solve problems and share her expertise. Some of them even started inviting me to their off-duty social gatherings. She paused, her expression growing almost wistful. It was really quite touching how much they appreciated my contributions to ship operations. Though I suppose they might have been less enthusiastic if they had realized that every helpful suggestion was also a detailed analysis of their vulnerabilities. After your story about helpful consultations and security briefings, Vex said, setting down his datapad with deliberate care, I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation into your background, Maya Kane. For the first time since the interrogation began, Maya's casual demeanor shifted slightly. Not fear, exactly, but the focused attention of someone who knew the game was entering a new phase. Oh, she said, still smiling, but her eyes had gone very still. Find anything interesting? Vex pulled up a new file, one that had taken considerable effort to obtain through military intelligence channels. Maya Kane, born on Terra Colony 7. Parents, civilian engineers working in atmospheric systems design. Excellent student, showed early aptitude for biochemistry and environmental sciences. Maya remained silent, but her fingers had stopped their casual movement. Graduated top of her class from the Colonial Engineering Institute at age 20. Specialty, environmental systems integration for military applications. Vex looked up from his datapad. Not exactly the background of a simple botanist, is it? People change careers, Maya said quietly. Life takes unexpected turns. Indeed it does, Vex agreed, especially when those turns involve joining the Human Colonial Defense Force as a lieutenant in the Environmental Warfare Division. The silence that followed was different from Maya's previous casual pauses. This was the silence of someone carefully considering what information to reveal and what to keep hidden. Environmental Warfare Division, Vex continued, reading from the classified file. It's a specialized unit responsible for developing methods to disable enemy installations through manipulation of life support systems, atmospheric contamination, and biological disruption of technical infrastructure. Maya's smile had disappeared entirely. Your service record makes for fascinating reading, Vex said, scrolling through the document. Recommendations for developing new techniques in atmospheric sabotage. Recognition for innovations in biological systems warfare. A particular talent for turning enemy infrastructure against itself through seemingly minor modifications. That was a long time ago, Maya said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. 6 years, Vex corrected. You served for 4 years, achieved the rank of captain, and were being considered for promotion to major when you suddenly resigned your commission and enrolled in civilian botanical research programs. Vex set down the military file and picked up another document. Medical records from that period are heavily redacted, but the psychological evaluation summary is quite revealing. post-traumatic stress following the Kepler Station incident. Recommendation for extended therapy and career transition support. Maya's hands had clenched into fists, and Vex realized he had found the source of whatever had transformed a military officer into a civilian researcher. What happened at Kepler Station, Maya? The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I did my job," she said. "I did exactly what I was trained to do, exactly what my commanding officers wanted. And 14,000 civilians died because the enemy commander decided to blow the station rather than surrender." Vex felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. Kepler Station had been a notorious incident in the border conflicts, a civilian habitat that had been caught between military forces and destroyed in the crossfire. "You were responsible for the environmental system's failure that disabled their defenses," Vex said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I created a small atmospheric imbalance that would have forced them to surrender within hours," Maya said, her voice growing harder. "Non-lethal, completely reversible, minimal casualties. A textbook environmental warfare operation that should have ended the siege without bloodshed." She looked up at Vex, and her eyes held the kind of pain that came from carrying responsibility for unintended consequences. But Commander Torres decided that surrender was unacceptable. So he triggered the reactor overload and took the entire station with him rather than let us capture it intact. "And you blamed yourself." "I blamed the system that turned environmental science into a weapon," Maya corrected. "I blamed the military mindset that reduces complex problems to simple solutions. I blamed myself for being naive enough to think that there were clean ways to wage war." Vex made another note, beginning to understand the psychology behind Maya's methods. "So you retired from military service and became a botanist." "I thought I could go back to what I loved," Maya said with a bitter laugh. "Pure research, helping things grow instead of making them die. Spending my days in greenhouses instead of planning sabotage operations. Living a quiet, peaceful life where my expertise would never be used to hurt anyone." "But expertise like yours does not simply disappear," Vex observed. "No," Maya agreed softly. "It does not. Turns out that understanding how to keep biological systems healthy also means understanding exactly how to make them sick. Knowing how to optimize environmental conditions means knowing how to create conditions that are less than optimal." Maya leaned back in her chair, and her casual demeanor began to return, though now it carried a different weight. "The problem with trying to forget military training is that crisis situations have a way of reminding you what you know," she said. "When your people captured that transport, when they started treating passengers like cargo to be processed and sold, well, old habits die hard." Vex consulted his psychological profile notes, pieces of a complex puzzle finally beginning to fit together. "The trauma from Kepler Station did not make you less dangerous," he realized. "It made you more dangerous, because it removed your faith in official channels and legitimate authority." "Bingo," Maya said, and her smile was back, sharp and predatory. "Turns out that a military engineer with no respect for rules or chain of command is significantly more problematic than one who follows orders and operates within established parameters. Because you no longer felt constrained by military protocols or rules of engagement. Because I no longer cared about minimizing collateral damage or preserving enemy assets for intelligence value," Maya corrected. "When you stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like someone who has been kidnapped by pirates and is facing a very unpleasant future, your tactical priorities shift dramatically." Vex stared at his files, finally understanding what his people had actually captured. Not a harmless civilian botanist. Not even a retired military officer. They had captured a highly trained sabotage specialist who had been stripped of every reason to show restraint. "The botanical research was real," Maya continued, as if reading his thoughts. "I genuinely loved that work, genuinely wanted to leave the military applications behind. But 6 years of growing plants does not erase 4 years of learning how to destroy things efficiently." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. Though I will say that the plant research did teach me some new techniques. Biological systems in agricultural applications are much more delicate than military installations. You have to be more subtle, more patient, more creative in your approach. More creative? Vex repeated weakly. Well, yes. When you are trying to optimize growth conditions for exotic fungi, you learn to think about chemical interactions in ways that military engineering does not typically cover. Complex cascade reactions, delayed effect compounds, biological processes that can be triggered remotely. Maya's smile widened, and Vex realized with growing horror that her civilian career had not been a retirement from warfare. It had been advanced training. Plus, botanists tend to have access to research facilities with all sorts of interesting equipment and chemical libraries, Maya added casually. Amazing what you can synthesize when you have legitimate reasons to be experimenting with organic compounds. You have been preparing for something like this, Vex said. I have been trying to live a peaceful life, Maya corrected. But I have also been realistic about the fact that the galaxy is not always a peaceful place. Sometimes circumstances arise that require practical solutions to complex problems. She looked at Vex with those deceptively innocent eyes, and he finally understood what he was dealing with. Maya Kane was not a retired soldier who had become a botanist. She was a weapon that had learned how to grow. Day 7, Maya said, and her voice took on the tone of someone describing a particularly satisfying puzzle solution, was when I decided that my stay aboard the Dominion's Edge had become unproductive. Vex braced himself. Every instinct told him that this was where Maya's carefully orchestrated sabotage would reach its culmination. The trigger was actually quite mundane, Maya continued, absently braiding another strand of her hair. Commander Voss had received new orders during the night shift. Change of destination, new timeline, updated prisoner processing protocols. Apparently, we were being diverted to a facility where civilian captives would be, well, let's just say the accommodations would be significantly less comfortable. So you decided to take action. I decided to implement a comprehensive solution to our logistical challenges, Maya corrected with that maddening precision. The beauty of the plan was that I had spent 6 days establishing exactly the right conditions. Every system I needed to access, every person I needed to trust me, every safety protocol I needed disabled. It was all already in place. Maya settled back in her chair, and as suddenly, Vex realized with growing dread that she was about to describe the systematic destruction of his people's ship with the same casual enthusiasm most beings reserved for discussing their hobbies. The operation began at 0700 hours, ship time, Maya said. I was in the hydroponics bay with Chief Nurian, supposedly conducting a final check on the fungal treatment we had implemented. Except instead of monitoring the beneficial microorganisms, I introduced a secondary culture that I had been cultivating in my cell for the past 3 days. Cultivating how? Vex asked, though he suspected the answer would violate several biological warfare treaties. Well, the food dispensers in our section provided excellent raw materials, Maya explained cheerfully. Protein compounds, mineral supplements, trace elements, everything you need to grow really interesting bacterial cultures if you know the right combinations. Plus, the waste recycling system provided a perfect incubation environment. Vex stared at her. You turned your toilet into a biological weapons laboratory. I turned basic sanitation facilities into a biochemical research platform, Maya corrected. The bacterial strain I developed was actually quite elegant, harmless to organic matter, but absolutely devastating to the specific metal alloys used in Corvani atmospheric processing systems. Maya began counting on her fingers, and Vex knew he was about to hear a list of cascading failures that would make his molting schedule permanently irregular. The culture was designed to spread through the air recycling network within 4 hours, corroding filtration systems, contaminating sensor arrays, and producing chemical byproducts that would trigger emergency shutdowns throughout the environmental grid. She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. Of course, the emergency shutdowns were exactly what I wanted, because they would activate the manual override protocols that Sergeant Kovac and I had so carefully optimized during the atmospheric crisis on Day 4. Vex felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. The safety bypasses you convinced them to install. The efficiency improvements we implemented together, Maya corrected, which happened to include remote access capabilities that I could trigger from any environmental monitoring station on the ship. Maya's smile widened, and Vex realized that every helpful suggestion, every friendly consultation, every seemingly innocent optimization had been part of a coordinated attack plan. But at 0830, while Nurian was dealing with the spreading contamination in the hydroponics systems, I excused myself to check on the atmospheric processors in Section 12. Kovac had asked me to monitor the filtration efficiency there, so naturally I had legitimate access, where you triggered the next phase, where I activated the secondary modifications I had suggested during our previous collaboration, Maya said with obvious satisfaction. Remember those cooling techniques I recommended when the processors were running hot? Turns out that certain chemical compounds can provide excellent thermal regulation right up until they reach critical saturation levels. Maya paused, her expression growing almost wistful. The thermal cascade began in Section 12 and propagated through the entire atmospheric processing network within 20 minutes. Emergency cooling systems activated automatically, which triggered the chemical release protocols I had helped engineer Keldon optimize for maximum efficiency. Chemical release protocols, Vex repeated weakly. Well, you need rapid response capabilities when dealing with potential overheating events, Maya explained reasonably. The modifications we implemented ensured that cooling agents would be dispersed immediately throughout affected areas, preventing dangerous temperature spikes. She shrugged that casual shrug that had become the soundtrack to Vex's professional nightmares, but the fact that those cooling agents became highly toxic when mixed with the bacterial byproducts from the hydroponics contamination. Well, that was just an unfortunate chemical interaction that nobody could have predicted. Vex consulted his incident reports, watching a pattern of simultaneous system failures that had seemed random at the time, but now revealed themselves as precisely coordinated strikes. At 0915, Maya continued, the atmospheric contamination reached critical levels throughout the ship. Automated emergency protocols activated the backup life support systems, which unfortunately had been modified with those security improvements that Officer Renz and I had developed to prevent biological warfare attacks. The improvements that made the ship more vulnerable to exactly the type of attack you were conducting. The improvements that provided enhanced monitoring and response capabilities, Maya corrected with wounded innocence, including remote diagnostic access that allowed authorized personnel to assess system status from any security terminal on the ship. Maya's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm, and Vex realized she was approaching the climactic phase of her operation. The beautiful thing about remote diagnostic access is that it also provides remote control capabilities, if you know the right command sequences. Which I did, thanks to all those educational conversations with Security Officer Renz about potential vulnerabilities. You took control of the life support systems. I implemented emergency protocols designed to protect the crew from biological contamination, Maya said with that infuriating precision. Standard procedures call for isolating affected areas, redirecting atmospheric flow to prevent contamination spread, and activating emergency air supplies in critical sections. Maya paused, her smile taking on a particularly predatory quality. Of course, when you isolate every section of the ship simultaneously, redirect all atmospheric flow to waste disposal systems, and activate emergency air supplies that have been contaminated with toxic compounds, well, the protective measures become somewhat counterproductive. Vex stared at his datapad, finally understanding the scope of what had happened. Maya had not just sabotaged individual systems. She had turned the ship's own safety protocols into weapons against the crew. But the truly elegant part, Maya continued, clearly warming to her favorite subject, was the gravitational cascade that began at 0945. Gravitational cascade? Well, when atmospheric pressure drops throughout the ship, automated systems compensate by adjusting artificial gravity to maintain structural integrity. Maya explained with the patience of someone teaching basic physics. Perfectly sensible engineering, really. except that the gravity generators had been modified with those power optimization techniques that engineering specialist Keldon and I had developed. Maya began counting on her fingers again, and Vex prepared for another list of catastrophic improvements. Enhanced energy efficiency, improved response times, automated load balancing across multiple generator arrays, all absolutely legitimate upgrades that happen to include manual override capabilities accessible from environmental control stations. You turned off the gravity. I implemented variable gravity protocols designed to assist with emergency evacuation procedures, Maya corrected. Reducing gravitational stress in affected areas, redirecting power to critical systems, optimizing movement corridors for crew safety. She shrugged that maddening shrug. Though I suppose that reducing gravity to 0% in the weapons bays while simultaneously increasing it to 300% in the crew quarters might have created some logistical challenges for the emergency response teams. Vex realized with growing horror that Maya had essentially turned the ship into a death trap, using modifications that the crew had implemented themselves based on her helpful suggestions. The final phase began at 1000 hours, Maya said, her voice taking on the satisfied tone of someone describing a perfectly executed plan. By that point, most of the crew was either incapacitated by atmospheric contamination, trapped by gravitational anomalies, or dealing with cascading system failures throughout the ship, and you made your escape. I implemented the emergency evacuation protocol that Chief Nurian and I had discussed during our food safety consultations, Maya said cheerfully. You know, the procedures for jettisoning contaminated materials when biological hazards threaten the food supply. Maya's smile widened to absolutely terrifying proportions. Turns out that Cargo Bay 7, where the escape pods were stored, each could be classified as contaminated material if you filed the right emergency reports through the food safety monitoring system. Vex stared at her, understanding dawning like a particularly unpleasant sunrise. You ejected yourself in an escape pod. I evacuated critical personnel from a biologically compromised environment, Maya corrected. Standard emergency procedure, properly documented through official channels, completely legitimate under ship safety protocols. She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. Though I suppose it was unfortunate that the ejection sequence included automated decontamination procedures that involved venting the entire cargo bay to space, and that the cargo bay happened to contain several important structural supports, and that the decontamination process triggered explosive charges designed to prevent contamination spread. Maya trailed off, looking almost apologetic. Really, the ship's destruction was just a side effect of proper safety procedures. I was simply following the protocols that the crew had taught me. Vex set down his datapad and stared at Maya Kane, finally understanding what his people had encountered. Not a prisoner who had escaped, a weapon that had activated itself. Vex sat in absolute silence for several minutes, staring at Maya Kane while his mind processed the full scope of what he had just heard. 1,400 trained Corvani soldiers, engineers, and officers in a state-of-the-art battleship, all destroyed by a woman who grew vegetables for a living. You used our own systems against us, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Our own safety protocols, our own crew, our own trust. I used the resources available to me, Maya corrected with that same maddening reasonableness. When you are outnumbered 1,400 to 1, you have to be creative about force multiplication. Vex's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation that he could not suppress. But you were not even a soldier anymore. You were a civilian, a botanist, a researcher. Maya tilted her head, studying him with those deceptively innocent brown eyes. And that, she said softly, is exactly what made me so dangerous. I do not understand. Maya leaned forward slightly, and for the first time during the entire interrogation, her casual mask slipped completely away. What remained was something cold, calculating, and utterly merciless. Soldiers have rules, Vex. They have codes of conduct, rules of engagement, chain of command structures that limit their actions. They think in terms of objectives and acceptable losses and strategic value. She smiled, and the expression sent ice forming along Vex's exoskeleton. Civilians, well, we just want to go home. And we really do not care what we have to break to make that happen. Vex stared at her, understanding finally dawning with the force of a supernova. You are saying that human civilians are more dangerous than human soldiers. I am saying that human soldiers are constrained by military thinking, Maya corrected. They want to win battles, capture territory, achieve strategic objectives. But civilians? We are not trying to win wars. Her smile widened, and Vex realized with growing horror what she was about to tell him. We are just trying to survive them, and survival does not follow rules. Maya sat back in her chair, her casual demeanor returning as if the moment of revelation had never happened. So when your intelligence services analyze the threat posed by humanity, make sure you understand the distinction. Our soldiers are predictable, manageable, bound by conventions and protocols. She shrugged that familiar casual shrug one final time. Our civilians, on the other hand, well, we are just gardeners and engineers and teachers and researchers who want to get back to our families. And there is absolutely nothing we will not do to make that happen. Vex looked at his datapad, then at Maya, then back at his datapad. Somewhere in the casual recitation of helpful consultations and friendly conversations, she had described the complete destruction of his people's finest warship, all while maintaining the fiction that she was just a harmless botanist who had been trying to help. The worst part, Vex said quietly, is that you convinced them to help you do it. The worst part, Maya corrected with obvious satisfaction, is that you still think I am the exception rather than the rule. And in that moment, as Vex stared into the eyes of the woman who had destroyed 1,400 lives with nothing but plant knowledge and a friendly smile, he realized that the Corvani Empire had made a terrible mistake. They had thought they were fighting humanity's soldiers. They had no idea what their civilians were capable of.